Welcome, everyone. We're so happy you joined us today to discuss a return to normal, how trauma may affect prevention, and how we may respond. Let's take a moment to truly transition to this time together by taking a mindful pause. At this time, I invite you to place your feet flat on the floor and sit in a comfortable but upright position. Just checking in with yourself and your body. And if you wish, you can close your eyes. If you prefer, you can leave them open and softly gaze them down a few feet in front of you. Just feel your physical body. We've been moving from meeting to meeting or task to task. Right now, let's take a moment to breathe and come into this moment, leaving the previous tasks in the background. In this moment, turn your attention to your body and your breath. Just breathe normally. What sensations do you feel? Where do you feel your breath the strongest? The nose, the belly? Where? Just noticing, how does your body feel right now? In a moment, we will shift from breathing normally to taking 3 nourishing deep breaths. And now, let's take our first deep nourishing breath. Inhaling into the lungs, feeling that expansion of breath, and then release it. What is here for you right now? Maybe you feel tired, maybe excited. Whatever you are feeling, just notice it. And now take another deep breath. Noticing the physical sensations of breathing. Maybe you'll notice a little tension release. One more time. Inhale and let it go. Even something simple like taking 3 deep breaths can be just the moment of pause you may need in your day. So remember, when you need it, take pause and come back to your breath. Now let's get started. I want to bring to your attention that trauma can be a hard subject for people to discuss. So please take care of yourself during our time together. What guided us in preparing this webinar and selecting these objectives is that prevention services may have been altered or interrupted for now. But what happens when they resume? Will everything go back to the way it was? It's almost certain that people will serve in prevention will have been through stress, hardship, and possibly mental health challenges. This webinar will serve as an introduction to trauma-informed care as seen through the lens of prevention providers, and will help to explain some of the differences we may see and how we can prepare for them. I will briefly go over our 4 objectives for this webinar. Introduction to trauma-informed care, connect the dots between traumatic experiences and health problems, identifying ways of infusing trauma-informed care into existing prevention practices, and understanding that self-care is an essential part of providing trauma-informed care. So now I will turn the time over to my colleague, Enos.
Thank you very much, Jen. Before I start talking about a trauma framework, I just want to read this quote. The more healthy relationships a child has, the more likely they will be to recover from trauma and thrive. Relationships are the agents of change, and the most powerful therapy is love. Understanding trauma-informed care means understanding the way that experiences affect us. Trauma is not significant for its rarity, rather for its universality. Providing care in a trauma-informed manner promotes positive health outcomes. A trauma-informed approach is defined by SAMHSA as a program, organization, or system that realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands potential paths to recovery, recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff, and others involved within the system, and responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, and seeks to actively resist re-traumatization. So what is trauma? Trauma results from an event, series of events, or a set of circumstances experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. This definition of trauma is fairly broad, and it intentionally does not allow for others to determine whether a particular event is traumatic. That is up to each survivor. In other words, trauma is defined by the experience of the survivor. Two people could undergo the same horrible event, and one person might be traumatized while the other person remains relatively unscathed. So trauma and health outcomes. Let's talk a little bit about what the research says. The CDC and Kaiser Permanente Adverse Childhood Experiences Study is one of the largest investigations of childhood abuse and neglect and household challenges and later life health and well-being. The original ACE study was conducted by Kaiser Permanente from 1995 to 1997 with 2 waves of data collection. In late 1990s, a group of doctors and public health researchers discovered a strong link between childhood trauma and chronic diseases. The study they conducted is called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, also known as ACEs. The study asked 17,000 mostly white middle-class people with health insurance questions about their experience earlier in life. They asked about 10 different ACEs, which are captured in the slide that you see here. Then they assessed their current health records. They found that the more ACEs a person had, the more likely the person was to have a wide array of chronic health problems, lower life potential, and more behaviors that could cause health problems such as smoking or drug use. People who have 5 or more ACEs were 14 times more likely to have injected drugs than people with no ACEs. However, ACEs are not uncommon. About half of all adults have at least one ACE. In New England, about 10% of children under the age of 17 have 3 or more ACEs. The ACE pyramid represents the conceptual framework for the ACE study. The ACE study has uncovered how ACEs are strongly related to the development of risk factors for disease and well-being throughout the course of life. Adverse childhood experiences, also ACEs, are categorized into 3 groups: abuse, neglect, and household challenges. All ACE questions refer to the respondent's first 18 years of life. The ACEs studied in the original research were divided into 2 categories: those related to childhood abuse and those related to household dysfunction. Having a family member attempt or die by suicide, substance misuse, mental health problems, instability due to parental separation or household members being in jail. These are all aspects of a child's environment that can undermine their sense of safety, stability, and bonding. Some of the major findings in the ACEs study are common. ACEs are common across all populations. Almost 2/3 of the study participants reported at least one ACE, and more than 1 in 5 reported 3 or more ACEs. Some populations are more vulnerable to experience ACEs because of the social and emotional and economic conditions in which they live, work, play, and learn. The ACE score is a total sum of the different categories of ACEs reported by the participant. Study findings show that a grade dose response relationship between ACEs and the negative health and well-being outcomes. In other words, as the number of ACEs increases, so does the risk of negative outcomes. ACEs are linked to chronic health problems, mental illness, and substance misuse in adults. ACEs can also negatively impact education and job opportunities. ACEs have long-lasting negative effects on health, well-being, and opportunities. These experiences can increase the risk of injury, sexually transmitted infections, marital and child health problems, teen pregnancy, involvement in sex trafficking, and a wide range of chronic diseases that are the leading causes of death, such as cancer, diabetes, heart disease, and suicide. ACEs and the associated conditions, such as living in under-resourced or racially segregated neighborhood, frequently moving, or experiencing food insecurity, can cause toxic stress, which is defined as extended or prolonged stress. Toxic stress from ACEs can change the brain development and affect such things such as attention, decision-making, learning, and the responses to stress. Since the first study was completed, there have been numerous follow-up studies with different populations and with more types of trauma, including community-level trauma like poverty, discrimination, or community violence. The research has consistently shown that the more childhood trauma people experience from within their homes or communities, the more likely they are to have chronic diseases and worse life outcomes. This figure shows how adverse community environments such as poverty, violence, poor housing quality, and discrimination are likely to soil a tree grows in, often influencing the household young people live in. Trauma does not occur in a vacuum, however. Individual trauma occurs in the context of community. Whether the community is defined geographically, like in neighborhoods, virtually like shared identity, ethnicity, or experiences, or organizationally, such as the place of work, learning, or worship. How a community responds to individual trauma sets the foundation for the impact of the traumatic event, experience, and its effect. Communities that provide a context of understanding and self-determination may facilitate the healing and recovery process for the individual. Alternatively, communities that avoid, overlook, or misunderstand the impact of trauma may often be re-traumatizing and interfere with the healing process. Individuals can be re-traumatized by the very people who intend to help them. This is one way to understand trauma in the context of community. A second and equally important perspective on trauma and communities is the understanding that communities as a whole can also experience trauma. Just as with trauma of the individual or family, a community may be subjected to a community-threatening event, have a shared experience of that event, and have an adverse prolonged effect. Whether it's the result of a natural disaster such as a flood, or hurricane, or earthquake, or the event or circumstances influenced by one group to another, which is forced relocation, servitude, mass incarceration as a few. The resulting trauma is often transmitted from one generation to the next in a pattern often referred to as historical, community, or intergenerational trauma. I'll talk a little bit about the long-term defense of trauma. The data shows that ACEs contribute to social, emotional, and cognitive impacts, which contribute to the adaptation of risk behaviors, which can lead to disease, disabilities, and social problems, which can contribute to early death. So some of the cognitive impacts of trauma are slowed language development, attention problems, speech delay, poor verbal memory recall, lower IQ. Many of these consequences are linked to the stress hormones and neurotransmitters that are associated with a prolonged stress response. Some of the social impacts of trauma include aggression, poor self-control of emotion, can't modify behavior in response to social cues, and social isolation. And some of the emotional consequences are poor and social emotional development, alcohol, tobacco, and other drug misuse to manage intense emotional stress, vacillation between numb and overreacting emotional state. What does trauma look like? Science shows that early exposure to circumstances that produce persistent fear or chronic anxiety can have a lifelong effect on us. The long-term effect activation of the stress response system and the overexposure of cortisol and other stress hormones that follows can disrupt almost all of your body's processes. This puts you in increased risk for many health problems. Now let's talk about how the stress response and trauma show up in our body and mind. Repeated trauma results in an altered neural system that is more reactive to stress over time. Thus, even neutral interactions can produce reactions. We all react to trauma in different ways, experiencing a wide range of physical and emotional reactions. There is no right or wrong way to think, feel, or respond, so don't judge your own reactions or those of others. Your responses are normal reactions to an abnormal event. Emotional and psychological symptoms such as shock, denial, or disbelief, acting like nothing happened, confusion, difficulty concentrating, anger, irritability, mood swings, emotional reactivity, anxiety, fear, and clinging are all examples of that. Well, the emotional and psychological symptoms include guilt, shame, self-blaming, withdrawing from others, feeling sad or hopeless, feeling disconnected or numb. Physical symptoms consist of insomnia, nightmares, fatigue, being startled easily, difficulty concentrating. Some more physical symptoms are racing heartbeat, edginess and agitation, aches and pains, muscle tension. So common adaptations to trauma include, as mentioned before, numbing, avoidance, detachment, dissociation, suicidality, self-harm, substance use disorder, or isolation, are all of which result in excessively risky behaviors. Each of these adaptations in effect to manage the current stressor. Some trauma would overwhelm somebody's ability to manage, regardless of their age at the onset of the event. It is critical to understand these adaptations from the point of view of the survivor. It is equally critical for the survivor to understand these various adaptations as their best efforts to cope at the time. Now, I will pass this on to Jen for the next section. Thank you.
Thanks, Enos. So let's talk about trauma and COVID-19. Any traumatic event, from a personal tragedy to a global crisis like COVID-19, can take an emotional toll and cause traumatic stress. As the coronavirus pandemic rapidly sweeps across the world, it is inducing a considerable degree of fear, worry, and concern in the population at large, and among certain groups in particular, such as older adults, care providers, and people with underlying health conditions. In public mental health terms, the main psychological impact to date is elevated rates of stress or anxiety. And with the physical distancing impacts on many people's usual activities, routines, and livelihoods, there is a lot of discussion about the potential for increased levels of loneliness, depression, anxiety, harmful alcohol and drug use, self-harm or suicidal behavior, and some experiencing COVID-19 as a traumatic event itself. It is normal to experience traumatic stress following a disturbing event, whether it's the coronavirus pandemic, a traffic accident, plane crash, violent crime, terrorist attack, or a natural disaster, such as an earthquake, a hurricane, or a flood. One may feel a variety of emotions, such as intense shock, confusion, and fear, or feel numb or overwhelmed. Often one can feel several of these at the same time. In our current times of COVID-19, the round the clock news and social media coverage can create a bombardment of stories and images of tragedy, suffering, and loss. Traumatic stress disrupts one's sense of security, leaving one feeling helpless and vulnerable. People may feel physically and emotionally drained, overcome with grief, or find it difficult to focus, sleep, or control their emotions. These are all normal responses to abnormal events. Signs of stress during COVID-19 can include fear and worry about your own health and the health of your loved ones, changes in sleep or eating patterns, difficulty sleeping or concentrating, worsening of chronic health problems, worsening of mental health conditions, increased use of alcohol, tobacco, or other drugs. With the impact of COVID-19, engaging in trauma-informed care is essential. Now I will turn the time over to my colleague, Isaac.
Thank you, Jen, for that perspective. That really helps to give us some context. My name is Isaac Wolf. I'm a Prevention Systems Manager here at DBHR. And I wanted to talk to you guys today about what we can do as prevention professionals. So a trauma-informed approach can occur at a personal level, professional, or an organizational level. And it's hopefully present in all three. In a trauma-informed approach, we keep the 4 R's in mind. So you can see the 4 R's on your screen here: realize, recognize, respond, and resist re-traumatization. So a trauma-informed approach realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands potential paths for recovery. It recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, and staff and others involved with the system. It responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices. And it resists re-traumatization by avoiding well-meaning but potentially harmful practices. Well, a trauma-informed approach understands that trauma may play a role in every person you work with, and then universally accounts for that possibility, just like adding a wheelchair ramp into a building helps all sorts of people who aren't in wheelchairs, like delivery folks with hand carts or people who would just rather avoid the stairs. Trauma-informed approaches can make everyone's experience richer and more balanced. In a trauma-informed approach, all people at all levels of the organization or system have a basic realization about trauma and can understand how trauma affects families, groups, organizations, and communities, as well as individuals. People's experience and behavior are understood in the context of coping strategies designed to survive adversity and overwhelming circumstances. Whether these occurred in the past, for instance, a client who's dealing with prior child abuse, or whether they're currently manifesting, a staff member living with domestic violence in the home, or whether they're related to the emotional distress that results in hearing about firsthand experiences of another. So there's an understanding that trauma plays a role in mental and substance use disorders and should be systematically addressed in prevention, treatment, and recovery settings. So organizations do not have to treat trauma to have a trauma responsive approach. This is a really important point because a lot of folks, especially in prevention, get this idea that they have to somehow fix people's problems. But SAMHSA outlines 6 principles of trauma responsive approach. 1, safety. Take some time to ensure that people we serve feel physically and psychologically safe. 2, trustworthiness and transparency. Make sure that operations and decisions are conducted with transparency and the goal of building and maintaining trust among staff, clients, and family members of those receiving services. 3, peer support and mutual self-help. Encourage mentorship and healthy relationship building on your coalition and in your programs. 4, collaboration and mutuality. Grant power to those who are affected and share in decision making. Recognize that everyone has a role to play in trauma-informed approaches. One does not have to be a therapist to be therapeutic. 5, empowerment, voice, and choice. This is an important part of coalition work as well, so you should understand the need for this. When people make their own decisions about the next step, they have ownership over the process, and it means more to them. And 6, cultural, historical, and gender issues. Actively move past cultural stereotypes and biases. Offer culturally responsive services. Leverage the healing value of traditional cultural connections, and recognize and address historical trauma. It's important to note that actually exploring traumatic experiences with an individual or group requires sensitivity, skills, and training, and this is not in prevention scope of practice. However, building resilience is a valuable way to respond to trauma, as individuals can be taught skills that assist them to improve coping, manage emotions, connect with others, and find hope and purpose and meaning. And this is in prevention's wheelhouse. So let's dig into resilience aspects a little more. In prevention, we talk about the importance of relationships to youth, but the same is true of adults. We need to know that we can trust and rely on others in our lives. Using the framework of the trauma-informed relationships helps us to address the conditions of trauma. But what defines a trauma-informed relationship? You can use the acronym RICH to describe what is important to those who have been through traumatic events. So according to the Risk in Connection curriculum, a rich relationship is a growth-promoting relationship because it embodies respect, shares information, fosters connection, and generates hope. Rich relationships are the opposite of traumatizing relationships. They are healing in and of themselves. If the biggest step you take towards trauma-informed care is the development of rich relationships with those seeking help, you will have done something amazing. Think about the relationships you have formed over the years working in prevention, and see if you can incorporate more respect, information, connection, or hope into each one. And it will benefit you as well as it will benefit the people you're working with. But relationships are only one point of resilience. Resilience is the ability to overcome serious hardships. Some factors we can control or practice, but others are harder to change without help. All factors of resilience can be improved with intentional action and assistance, either taken by ourselves or with the help of others. So we've got a few of them on our screen here, and you're probably familiar with some of them, but all of these play a factor in developing resilience. So many of you may recognize these from your work with youth, but they apply to adults as well. Any person you meet in your work can benefit from better relationships, increased sense of hope, and opportunities to thrive. When you're summing up resiliency factors, if you want to make it really simple, try to think of the 3 C's. So connection, competence, and coping. I heard these from my good friend Vincent Perez at a presentation to a group of school school teachers who oftentimes have a lot on their mind, and it's hard for them to keep in mind what to focus on when it comes to trauma. So competence is something that we often overlook. Just feeling useful is a very helpful thing to people who are suffering from the effects of trauma. And connection. We all know the value of relationships and using rich relationships as a guide. And then coping skills, things like the mindful moment that we took at the beginning of this webinar. And I'm going to pass this off to Ray now, who's going to talk about prevention and trauma-informed care from a programmatic level.
Hi, Isaac. Thanks for this transition. So, how do we kind of take everything we just reviewed and infuse it with kind of the prevention services that our coalitions or organizations are implementing? So on the screen right now should look fairly familiar if you're a CPWI coordinator. It's some of the common strategies and programs that are in most every action plan. As far as how do we kind of put those things into place, there's a couple of commonalities that I think, regardless of whatever program you're offering, is worth mentioning. The first is just for your staff. By participating in this webinar, you're already on your way of being prepared, but take the information from this webinar, take the resources that we have available later on, and be sure to share it with staff, such as facilitators for your parenting programs or volunteers that help out with programs. The recording of this webinar and the websites of different resources listed at the end will be helpful. The second thing has to do with extra time. Many folks already build in extra time during the first session of a parenting workshop, but you may need to, now that we're in this, as we enter a post-COVID-19 world, we may need to allow more time to really process and share. But balancing, you don't want a situation where you end up spending the entire first session talking about COVID-19. So one approach you may want to take is something like giving a little timeline, saying, okay, we're going to go to 6 p.m. with this activity, and then we're going to move on to our next topic. A third thing that pretty much regardless of whatever program you're offering is to make sure you have referral and other resources available. And because different people process information different ways, have a mix of both digital and paper. So links to websites and business cards, have the information have both broad information and narrow information. So something broad would be very generalized website or a generalized brochure, but be prepared to provide resources and referrals that are specific in nature if folks have a specific need or a specific question. Another piece to keep in mind is taking a closer look at your program, at your curriculum, and see how you may need to make some adjustments. Role plays are an example. So at the beginning of this session, Jennifer walked us through a mindfulness exercise. Well, some social emotional learning programs involve a mindfulness exercise about closing eyes, lying down, and for some youth that may bring back traumatic experiences. So as you're looking at how you actually carry out the different programs, you may want to look to make sure you have opportunities for the participants to opt out or have alternatives. They can still do the mindfulness, but instead of lying down, they can sit up. Instead of closing their eyes, they can gaze at a spot in front of them. So here is that kind of the top half of that first list, and think of these more not as must-dos, but more as you may want to consider. Here's the bottom half, and we kind of have this design with a lot of blanks, just so how it may play out in your community, or if your organization may be different. Some initial thoughts for me about how to incorporate some of the trauma-informed approach to these types of prevention services would include, like for the mentoring program, having a training or reviewing information with the mentors. For a public awareness campaign, if it's allowable with your funding, you may have some messaging that touches on the overlap between mental health and substance abuse. And so that's just two examples. I will say in this slide deck, we've created this worksheet. So you can go in and print out this particular slide. We've got a couple of the items already pre-filled, but this slide is designed for you to go in, print out a copy, and think through and identify what makes the most sense for the programs that you're offering, and how to, again, what types of approaches to incorporate and utilize. We also have that same worksheet formatted in a slightly different slightly different layout. So the same spot that you find this PowerPoint and this recording of the PowerPoint, you will also find a separate one-pager Word file that you can use as a worksheet to plot out those different ideas. Earlier during this presentation, Enos spoke much in great detail about ACEs and ACEs in prevention. And just to tie it back to some of the stuff that he had talked about, there's a lot of programs that may not specifically say, hey, we're addressing ACEs, but when you look at the details of those programs, you can see the connections to ACEs and taking an ACEs-informed approach. So real briefly, something like Life Skills is a program where there's positive skills that are being developed, decision-making skills. Mentoring programs are an example of connecting youth to caring adults and activities. So I won't go into detail on each and every one of these, but just keep in mind there's many connections between existing prevention programs and strategies that you may already be doing, and building those resiliency factors that are super beneficial. At this point, I'm going to shift it over to my colleague Grace, who's going to be talking a bit about self-care.
Thank you, Ray. One principle of trauma-informed care is based on the idea that helpers are affected by this work and need to take good care of themselves as well. For this, you must take breaks when you need, stay away from graphic content, and listen to yourself. We are confronted with the constant flow of information, uncertainty, and day-to-day realities of caring for children, family, and loved ones. It is critical to find ways to connect with yourself. Some ways include meditation or yoga, journaling or reading, exercise, adequate sleep, eating healthy, and having self-compassion. Being kind to yourself and understanding these difficult times is extremely important. We should also try to let light in. We need sunlight, so make sure you get sunlight every day. And stay connected. Connect with your loved ones via text, calls, Skype, virtual book clubs, or other activities. Some tips to manage stress and anxiety. include tempering your expectations and being kind to yourself. Remember, most of us were not prepared for this. Anxiety, fear, worry, and grief, these are all normal reactions to an abnormal circumstance. Laundry piles, dirty dishes, messy rooms, do what you can. While we always suggest monitoring the use of children's screen time, both how much and what they are watching, this may be a time where children have more screen time than they are accustomed to. Just make sure that your children are practicing safe online behavior. It is also important to embrace a rigid state of flexibility. Most people of all ages thrive when they have predictable routines. If your children are preschool age or older, have them participate in the development of a daily schedule. And when, not if, the schedule gets derailed, see tip 1 above and be kind to yourself. Find ways to stay informed. There is a constant flow of information regarding COVID-19, and it is challenging to know what to think. Find trusted sources and limit your exposure to this material. Talk with people you trust about your concerns and how you're feeling. And don't forget, learning can be fun. With uncertainty about the return to school, many parents are fretting about the potential loss of academics for their children. Fortunately, daily activities carry immense opportunity for learning. Cooking teaches science and math. Yard work teaches about nature and can inspire creative art projects. And reading together enriches vocabulary and listening skills. But don't forget about yourself. There's something you want to know more about or a skill you want to learn? Every day, more and more free online classes are being offered, so take advantage of them. And as we already mentioned, engage in self-care. Take deep breaths, stretch, or meditate. Try to eat healthy, well-balanced meals, exercise regularly, get plenty of sleep, and avoid alcohol and drugs. Make time to unwind, and try to do some activities you enjoy. And now I'll send this back to Jen.
Thank you, Grace. So some takeaway messages from our time together today. That trauma-informed care is not therapy, nor is it a therapeutic intervention. It is a way of understanding those whom we serve. Trauma-informed care is not about doing extra work. It is about looking through the lens of trauma at the things you already know and adding that perspective to how you do your job. So you matter. You will be affected by your work. You are more powerful than you think. Therefore, we hope that you will use this training and others to tap into that power and learn to use it wisely and effectively in the service of those you serve. In our 2014 TED Talk on childhood trauma, Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris closed in saying, "The single most important thing that we need today is the courage to look at this problem in the face and say, this is real and this is all of us. I believe that we are the movement." The next few slides are web resources that Ray mentioned that are part of this presentation. So you can come back to these resources to gather more information as needed. So thank you for being with us here today, and thank you for valuing your communities and on approaching your work with a trauma-informed lens. For more information, please go to the Athena Forum, or you can email us at prevention@hca.wa.gov. So thank you. Thank you for being here. Take care of yourselves. And I want to say thank you to all of my colleagues that helped today, and take care of yourselves.